He took me to a spa for my birthday, but I found my daughter's name on the hotel bill. The words still echo in my mind like a death sentence I never saw coming. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if you, for even a second, feel that this sounds familiar, I just ask that you leave a like and subscribe. It will help me continue opening up about this. My name is Eleanor Bennett, and I turned 72 this past March. For 51 years, I wore my wedding ring like a badge of honor, polishing it every morning while I made coffee in the same ceramic mug I'd used since 1985. The kitchen window overlooked our backyard maple tree, the one Richard and I planted when Claire took her first steps beneath its shade. That tree grew tall and strong while I grew small and forgotten. I spent my entire adult life being the perfect wife, the devoted mother, the woman who gave everything and asked for nothing in return. I gave up my nursing school dreams to raise our daughter Claire. I worked double shifts at the diner when Richard lost his job in the recession, my feet swelling in those awful white shoes while I smiled at customers who barely saw me as human. I missed my own birthday parties, skipped vacations I'd dreamed about, and pushed every personal desire into a little mental box labeled, "Maybe when they don't need me anymore." That Tuesday morning in March started like any other. I was standing at the kitchen sink, washing dishes that never seemed to stay clean, when Richard walked in holding a glossy travel brochure. For a moment, I didn't recognize the man approaching me. His eyes had a light in them I hadn't seen in decades, like the young man who once called me his lighthouse in every storm. "Eleanor?" he said, his voice unusually warm. "I booked us a weekend at Rosewood Spa for your birthday. Just you and me." The plate I was washing slipped from my hands and shattered against the porcelain sink. I stood there, staring at the broken pieces, wondering if I'd heard correctly. Richard hadn't remembered my birthday in 5 years. 5 years of me baking his favorite chocolate cake on his special day, while my own passed, unnoticed, unmarked, except for a generic card picked up last minute from the grocery store checkout line. "Really?" I whispered, turning to face him. "Just us?" He stepped closer and kissed my weathered hand. The same hand that had changed his mother's diapers when she was dying. The hand that had sewn countless Halloween costumes, made thousands of lunches, wiped away tears from scraped knees and broken hearts. "You've done everything for this family," he said. And for a moment, I believed the sincerity in his voice. "Let me give you one weekend that's just for you." I cried right there in our kitchen, tears streaming down my face as I clutched that brochure like it was made of gold. The cover showed a serene woman in a white robe, her face peaceful and radiant. I imagined myself there, finally being pampered, finally being seen, finally mattering enough to someone to deserve such care. That night, I pulled out my best dress from the back of the closet. A navy blue number I'd bought 3 years ago, but never worn because there was never anywhere special enough to go. I painted my nails a soft pink color called Sunset Dreams, and spent an hour in front of the mirror, trying to see myself the way I hoped Richard might see me again. The drive to Rosewood Spa took 3 hours through winding mountain roads, lined with dogwood trees just beginning to bloom. I kept stealing glances at Richard as he drove, searching his profile for traces of the man who once wrote me love letters during his lunch breaks. He was quiet, unusually so, his jaw set in that way that usually meant he was thinking about work problems or money troubles. "Are you okay?" I asked softly, reaching over to touch his arm. "Just tired," he replied without looking at me. "Long week." I pulled my hand back and folded it with the other in my lap, telling myself not to take it personally. He was probably just stressed about the expense. The spa looked expensive in the photos, and I knew our fixed income didn't leave much room for luxuries. Maybe he was having second thoughts. Maybe he was already regretting this gesture of kindness. When we arrived at the resort, I gasped. It was even more beautiful than the brochure. All natural stone and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over a pristine lake. The lobby smelled like lavender and eucalyptus, and soft piano music drifted from hidden speakers. I felt underdressed in my carefully chosen outfit, suddenly aware of how long it had been since I'd been anywhere that required more than grocery store attire. At the check-in desk, Richard handed over his credit card and spoke to the young woman behind the counter. "The reservation should be under my daughter's name," he said casually. "Claire Bennett." I blinked, confused. Claire? Why would it be under Claire's name? Richard laughed quickly, the sound forced and strange. It's just how I had to book it online. Some technical thing with the website. Don't worry about it. The desk clerk smiled politely and handed us our keycards. Room 347. The elevators are just around the corner. Enjoy your stay. As we walked toward the elevators, something cold settled in my stomach. Why would he book a spa weekend for us under our daughter's name? Claire lived 4 hours away in Chicago and rarely even called, let alone helped plan romantic getaways for her parents. Our room was breathtaking. A corner suite with a king-size bed covered in white linens so crisp they looked like fresh snow. French doors opened onto a private balcony overlooking the lake, where ducks glided across the surface like living brushstrokes on a painting. There were plush bathrobes hanging in the closet and expensive toiletries arranged on the marble bathroom counter. But something felt wrong. There were no flowers, no champagne, no chocolate on the pillow or romantic touches that you'd expect for a birthday celebration. The room felt more like a business transaction than a romantic gesture, sterile despite its luxury. That evening, I dressed carefully for dinner, hoping we might recapture some of the magic from our early years together. But Richard complained of a headache before we even made it to the restaurant and went to bed immediately after room service delivered a simple meal we ate in awkward silence. I lay awake that night, listening to Richard's breathing and staring at the ceiling. I thought about all the nights I'd stayed up with him when he had the flu, bringing him soup and cool washcloths. I remembered nursing his mother through her final illness while he was too busy with work to help. I thought about the dinners I'd cooked, the laundry I'd folded, the household I'd managed while he focused on his career and his hobbies, and everything that mattered more than the woman who kept his life running smoothly. The man sleeping beside me with his back turned felt like a stranger. The next morning, Richard left early for what he said was a massage appointment. I decided to visit the front desk to ask about scheduling my own spa treatments. Maybe a facial or a massage to help me relax and enjoy what was supposed to be my special weekend. The young woman at the desk looked up my reservation with a friendly smile. "Let me just pull up your booking details," she said, her fingers clicking across the keyboard. "And I'll print you a copy of the receipt for your records." "Oh, that's not necessary," I started to say, but she was already printing something out. She handed me the paper with that same polite smile. "Here you go, Mrs. Bennett. Is there anything else I can help you with today?" I took the receipt automatically, my eyes scanning the printed details without really focusing, until one line made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. Primary guest, Claire Bennett. The paper trembled in my hands. I read it again, certain I was mistaken. But there it was, in clear black ink, my daughter's name as the primary guest on what was supposed to be my birthday celebration. "Excuse me," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "This says Claire Bennett as the primary guest, but this is supposed to be for my husband and me." The desk clerk looked confused and pulled up the reservation on her screen again. "It shows here that the room was booked and paid for by Claire Bennett. Richard Bennett is listed as an additional guest and you're not actually listed on the reservation at all." The lobby began to spin around me. I gripped the edge of the marble counter to keep from falling as the truth hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't my birthday surprise. This wasn't Richard finally remembering how to love me. This was something else entirely. Something involving my daughter and my husband that I wasn't meant to discover. I stumbled back to our room on unsteady legs, the receipt clutched in my trembling hand, like evidence of a crime I didn't yet understand. Richard was still gone, probably enjoying his massage while I fell apart in a hotel lobby, finally seeing the truth that had been hidden from me. I sat on the edge of that perfect white bed, still wearing the hopeful outfit I'd chosen for a birthday celebration that was never meant for me, and felt something crack open in my chest. Not my heart, because that would suggest something clean and sudden. This was messier, deeper, like the sound of a foundation giving way after years of bearing more weight than it was designed to handle. For 51 years, I had been carrying a load I never should have had to bear alone. And now, in this beautiful room that wasn't even booked in my name, the entire structure of my life was finally collapsing. I sat in that hotel room for what felt like hours, staring at the receipt that had shattered my world. But as the shock began to wear off, memories started flooding back. Memories I'd pushed down, explained away, or simply ignored because the truth was too painful to face. Claire had always been Daddy's little girl. Even as a baby, she would reach for Richard the moment he walked through the door, her tiny arms stretching toward him while I stood in the background, formula-stained and exhausted from sleepless nights. I told myself it was natural, healthy even. A father should adore his daughter. But somewhere along the way, that adoration had twisted into something else entirely. I remembered the fights we'd had when Claire was 16. She would storm out of the house after our arguments, only to return hours later with Richard's arm around her shoulders, both of them looking at me like I was the unreasonable one. "Mom's just being dramatic again," Claire would say, and Richard would nod sympathetically, never once asking for my side of the story. When Claire went to college, I was the one who worked extra shifts to help pay for her tuition. Richard's salary covered the basics, but the extras, her sorority fees, spring break trips, the expensive laptop she absolutely needed, those came from my tips and overtime hours. My feet would ache so badly some nights that I could barely walk from the car to our front door. But I never complained. That's what mothers do, I told myself. We sacrifice. But it was Richard who got the credit. He was the one who visited her on Parents' Weekend, charming her friends and professors while I stayed home to work. He was the one she called when she had problems with boyfriends or needed advice about her future. I was just the woman who sent care packages and birthday cards that often went unacknowledged. After graduation, Claire moved to Chicago for a marketing job. She visited maybe 3 times a year, usually around holidays. And even then, she seemed more interested in spending time with her father than with me. They would sit together on the couch, talking about politics and business, and books I'd never had time to read. I would serve them coffee and homemade cookies, then retreat to the kitchen to clean up while they bonded over intellectual conversations that somehow never included me. "Mom, you wouldn't understand," became Claire's favorite phrase whenever I tried to join their discussions. "It's about economic theory," or "it's about philosophy," or "it's about things you didn't study in school." The fact that I'd never finished school because I was too busy raising her was apparently irrelevant. Richard never defended me during these moments. Never said, "Actually, your mother is incredibly intelligent," or "maybe we should include Mom in this conversation." He would just nod along with Claire's dismissive comments, sometimes even chuckling as if my exclusion was amusing rather than heartbreaking. The financial abuse had started so gradually that I didn't recognize it for what it was. Richard handled all our major accounts, the mortgage, the investments, the savings. "I'm better with numbers," he would say whenever I asked questions about our finances. "Don't worry your pretty head about it." When I turned 65 and started receiving Social Security, Richard suggested I sign the checks over to him for better money management. When my mother died and left me a small inheritance, Richard convinced me to put it into an account he managed for tax purposes. When I wanted to use some of that money to take a ceramics class at the community center, he told me we couldn't afford such frivolous expenses. But somehow, there was always money for Richard's golf membership. Always money for Claire's emergencies. The time her car broke down and needed a new transmission, the deposit on her Chicago apartment, the designer furniture she absolutely had to have for her first real job. I started keeping a mental tally of all the times I'd been asked to sacrifice something so that Claire could have what she wanted. The family vacation to Florida that was canceled so Claire could go on a school trip to Europe. The anniversary dinner Richard forgot because he was helping Claire move into her college dorm. The Christmas when my gift was a generic gift card, while Claire received jewelry, electronics, and clothes that cost more than I spent on groceries in 6 months. "We need to prioritize Claire's future," Richard would say whenever I questioned these decisions. "She's just starting out in life. We've already had our chances." Had we? When exactly had I been given a chance to pursue my dreams, to be supported and celebrated and prioritized? When had anyone in this family asked what Eleanor wanted, what Eleanor needed, what might make Eleanor happy? The answer was never. Not once in 51 years of marriage had Richard ever asked me what I wanted to do with my life, what dreams I might still be harboring, what goals I might want to pursue. I was simply expected to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention and affection were left over after everyone else's needs had been met. During the pandemic, when the world shut down and families were forced to spend months together in close quarters, I thought maybe things would change. Maybe Richard and I would rediscover each other. Maybe we would remember why we fell in love in the first place. Instead, Richard spent most of his time on video calls with Claire. They would talk for hours about her work frustrations, her dating life, her apartment renovation. She was working from home too, and apparently needed constant emotional support to get through the isolation. Richard was happy to provide it, often disappearing into his office for these marathon conversations while I sat alone in the living room, wondering when I had become invisible in my own home. "Claire's really struggling with being alone," Richard would explain when I asked why he spent so much time talking to her. "She needs us right now." But what about what I needed? What about the fact that I was struggling too, isolated from my few friends, unable to work because the diner had closed temporarily? What about the fact that I was caring for an increasingly distant husband while watching my daughter monopolize the one relationship that was supposed to sustain me through difficult times? That's when I started noticing the other changes. Richard began taking longer showers, paying more attention to his appearance. He bought new clothes, casual, younger-looking outfits that he claimed were more comfortable for working from home. He started working out in the garage, something he hadn't done in years, and began dyeing his gray hair. When I complimented him on these changes, he would shrug them off, just trying to stay healthy. He would say, "Trying to feel young again." I assumed he was having some kind of midlife crisis, maybe motivated by fear of aging or retirement. I tried to be supportive, even though his new habits often excluded me. He would go for long walks without inviting me along. He would disappear for hours on mysterious errands that he never explained in detail. And the phone calls with Claire became even more frequent, often happening behind closed doors. Sometimes I would hear laughter, the kind of intimate, conspiratorial laughter that used to be reserved for conversations between us. When I asked what they found so amusing, Richard would say, "Oh, just some inside joke. You wouldn't get it." More and more, I felt like an outsider in my own family, like a housekeeper or caretaker rather than a wife and mother. I cooked their favorite meals, cleaned their messes, managed the household logistics that kept their lives running smoothly. But I wasn't invited into their emotional world, their shared experiences, their plans for the future. The final insult came last Christmas, when Claire announced she wouldn't be coming home for the holidays. "I'm just too busy with work," she said during one of her daily calls with Richard. "Maybe next year." But 2 days after Christmas, I saw photos on her social media of her at a ski resort in Colorado, laughing and drinking wine with friends she apparently did have time to see. When I mentioned this to Richard, he got angry with me for spying on Claire's private life. "She's an adult," he said. "She can spend her holidays however she wants." "But she lied to us," I protested. "She said she was working." "She probably didn't want to hurt your feelings by saying she had other plans," Richard replied, as if lying to spare my feelings was somehow more caring than simply telling the truth. That's when the question first formed in my mind. The terrible suspicion that I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried to push it away. Was I being used? Had I spent my entire adult life serving two people who saw me not as a beloved family member, but as a convenient resource to be exploited? Someone who would always be there to provide money, labor, and emotional support without expecting anything meaningful in return? Sitting in that spa room with the receipt in my hands, I finally had to face the possibility that the answer was yes. That everything I had interpreted as love might have been something much more calculated and cruel. The woman who had sacrificed her education, her career, her dreams, and her financial independence for her family had been nothing more than a means to an end, a useful tool that could be discarded the moment something better came along, and apparently, something better had. I couldn't sit still after finding that receipt. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper. But something inside me, some instinct I'd spent decades suppressing, was screaming that I needed to dig deeper. This wasn't just about a hotel reservation. There was something much darker happening here. Richard had been gone for over an hour, supposedly getting a massage. I stood up from the bed on unsteady legs and walked to his suitcase, which sat open on the luggage rack near the window. For 51 years, I had respected his privacy, never going through his belongings, never questioning his explanations. I had been the perfect, trusting wife. That woman died the moment I saw Claire's name on that receipt. With trembling fingers, I began searching through his clothes. At first, I found nothing unusual, just the typical items you'd expect a man to pack for a spa weekend. But then, tucked beneath his pajamas in a small zippered compartment, I found an envelope. Inside were photos. Not family photos. Not the kind of pictures a father keeps of his daughter's graduation or wedding. These were intimate photos of Claire, recent ones, based on her hairstyle. She was wearing clothes I'd never seen before, expensive-looking outfits that must have cost more than my monthly grocery budget. And in every single photo, she was smiling at the camera with an expression I'd never seen her use with me. Flirtatious, seductive, loving. My stomach lurched. I ran to the bathroom and dry-heaved over the toilet, my body rejecting what my mind was trying to process. When the nausea passed, I forced myself to go back and look again, hoping I'd misunderstood what I was seeing. But there were more photos underneath. Pictures of Richard and Claire together. Not father and daughter pictures. Pictures of them holding hands across restaurant tables in places I'd never been. Pictures of them on hiking trails, her head resting on his shoulder in a way that was anything but platonic. Pictures of them in what looked like hotel rooms, their faces close together, their body language speaking of an intimacy that made my skin crawl. At the bottom of the envelope was a receipt from a jewelry store in Chicago. A receipt for a silver bracelet, purchased 3 months ago, engraved with the words, "To Claire, forever us." The room began to spin. I clutched the bathroom doorframe to keep from collapsing, as the full horror of what I was discovering crashed over me like a tsunami. My husband and my daughter. My husband and my daughter. The words repeated in my mind like a broken record, each repetition making the reality more unbearable. How long had this been going on? How many of their conversations during the pandemic had been about more than just emotional support? How many times had I served them coffee and cookies while they were planning this? How many times had I worried about Claire being lonely while she was actually conducting an affair with my husband? I found more evidence in Richard's toiletry bag. Receipts from restaurants in Chicago where he'd claimed to be attending business conferences. Hotel receipts from weekends when he said he was visiting his brother in Milwaukee. Credit card statements showing charges for lingerie purchases and expensive dinners for two. The most devastating discovery was a small notebook tucked between his shirts. In Richard's handwriting, there were dates, times, and what appeared to be a schedule of their meetings. Some entries went back almost 2 years. 2 years of systematic betrayal, of lies, of a double life that had been conducted right under my nose while I worried about being a good wife and mother. One entry made my blood turn to ice. E suspicious about phone calls, need to be more careful. Another, C worried about money, reminded her about inheritance when E passes. And the most recent, spa weekend perfect opportunity. E won't suspect anything. They had been planning this trip not as a birthday surprise for me, but as a romantic getaway for themselves. I was supposed to be the cover story, the unwitting accomplice in my own humiliation. They had probably laughed about how easy it would be to deceive me, how trusting and stupid I was. I heard footsteps in the hallway outside our room. Richard was coming back. I quickly shoved everything back into his suitcase exactly as I'd found it, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. When he entered the room, I was sitting on the bed, staring out the window at the lake, trying to look normal while my entire world had just been incinerated. "How was your massage?" I asked, and was amazed that my voice sounded almost normal. "Great," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Really relaxing. You should book one for yourself." The casual lies rolled off his tongue so easily. How many thousands of lies had he told me over the years? How many times had I believed his explanations, his excuses, his stories about where he'd been and what he'd been doing? That evening, Richard suggested we have dinner in the room. "I'm still feeling a bit tired," he said. "Let's just order room service and have a quiet night." A quiet night. While I sat across from him picking at food I couldn't taste, watching him text on his phone with the same secretive smile I'd seen in those photos, I realized this entire weekend was probably choreographed. He was probably texting Claire right now, telling her how the plan was working, how I suspected nothing. "Who are you texting?" I asked. trying to keep my voice light. "Just work stuff," he replied without looking up. "You know how it is?" I did know how it was. I knew that he was lying to my face while sitting 3 feet away from me. I knew that the man I'd loved and trusted for over 5 decades was capable of a cruelty I couldn't have imagined in my worst nightmares. After dinner, Richard claimed another headache and went to bed early. I lay awake next to him, listening to his breathing, studying his profile in the dim light from the bathroom. This was the man who had promised to love and cherish me until death do us part. This was the man I'd nursed through illnesses, supported through job losses, forgiven for countless small disappointments and failures. This was the man who was sleeping with our daughter. The next morning, while Richard was in the shower, his phone buzzed with a text message. Without thinking, I picked it up and saw Claire's name on the screen. The preview showed just enough to make my heart stop. "Can't wait to see you when she's gone. Love you, Daddy. Love you, Daddy." The words were like acid in my veins. The pet name she'd called him since childhood, now twisted into something obscene and unnatural. How had this happened? How had I raised a daughter capable of such betrayal? How had I married a man who could prey on his own child and destroy his wife simultaneously? When Richard came out of the bathroom, I was sitting in the chair by the window, fully dressed and holding my purse. "I want to go home," I said. "What? Why?" "We have another night here. I don't feel well. I think I'm coming down with something." He looked annoyed rather than concerned. "Can't you just rest here? We've already paid for the room." We. As if this had ever been about we. As if this weekend had ever been intended for both of us. "I want to go home now," I repeated, and something in my tone must have warned him not to argue further. The drive home was silent, except for the radio playing softly in the background. I stared out the passenger window at the passing landscape, seeing everything through new eyes. The coffee shop where Richard and I had our first date now looked shabby and sad. The church where we'd been married seemed like a monument to my own naivety. Even our neighborhood, when we finally pulled into our driveway, felt foreign and unwelcoming. That night, I sat alone in our living room after Richard had gone to bed, surrounded by family photos that now felt like evidence in a criminal case. Wedding pictures where we both looked so young and hopeful. Photos of Claire's birthday parties, Christmas mornings, family vacations. In every single picture, I could now see what I'd missed before. The way Richard's attention was always focused on Claire. The way she looked at him with adoration that went beyond normal father-daughter affection. Had I been blind? Or had I simply seen what I wanted to see? Had I ignored warning signs because the truth was too horrible to acknowledge? Or had they been that good at hiding their sickness from me? I found myself studying Claire's teenage years with new horror. The fights we'd had about boys, about curfews, about normal adolescent rebellion. Had those really been about normal teenage issues? Or had my daughter already been emotionally entangled with her father in ways that made other relationships impossible? I remembered the way she'd dismissed every boyfriend, complaining that they were immature or boring or not sophisticated enough for her. I remembered how she'd never brought anyone home for family dinners, never introduced us to anyone serious. I'd worried that she was too picky, that she'd never find someone good enough for her high standards. Now I understood that no man could ever compete with the one who had been grooming her since childhood, who had convinced her that their special relationship was normal and healthy, who had slowly poisoned her against me to eliminate any interference in their twisted bond. The most heartbreaking realization was that I had no one to turn to. Who would believe such a story? Who would accept that a respected man in our community was capable of such manipulation? Who would believe that my own daughter would participate in destroying me so completely? I was utterly, completely alone with knowledge that felt like poison in my veins. Knowledge that my entire life had been built on lies. Knowledge that the two people I loved most in the world saw me not as family, but as an obstacle to be removed. As I sat in that dark living room, surrounded by the remnants of a life that had never been real, one question haunted me more than any other. What were they planning to do with me now that I was no longer useful to them? The answer, I suspected, would be even more horrifying than what I'd already discovered. For 3 days after returning from the spa, I lived in a state of suspended animation. I moved through our house like a ghost, making Richard's coffee in the morning, preparing his meals, doing his laundry, all while knowing what I now knew. Every domestic task felt surreal, like playing house in someone else's life. Richard acted as if nothing had changed. He went about his routine, watched his evening news, complained about the weather, but I noticed things I'd never paid attention to before. The way he smiled when his phone buzzed, the way he excused himself to take business calls that always seemed to put him in a good mood, the way he hummed while getting dressed, as if he had something pleasant to look forward to. On Thursday evening, I couldn't stand it anymore. I was washing dishes, always washing dishes, when I heard him on the phone in the living room, his voice lower and more intimate than it had been with me in years. "I miss you too, sweetheart," he was saying. "Just a few more days and we can figure out the next step." The plate in my hand slipped and shattered on the kitchen floor. This time, I didn't cry. I didn't apologize. I just stared at the broken pieces and felt something harden inside my chest. When Richard appeared in the doorway, his phone already tucked away, I was still standing among the ceramic shards. "Careful, Eleanor," he said, reaching for the broom. "You're going to cut yourself." "Who were you talking to?" I asked without moving. "Work," he replied automatically, the lie flowing as easily as water. "There's a project deadline coming up." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a stranger who had shared my bed for 51 years while planning my destruction, a stranger who could lie to my face while fragments of my sanity lay scattered at my feet. "I know," I said quietly. "You know what? I know about Claire. I know about the hotels, the restaurants, the jewelry. I know about the pictures." Richard's face went through several expressions in quick succession: surprise, calculation, then something that looked almost like relief, as if he was tired of pretending. "Eleanor, don't." I held up my hand. "Don't lie to me anymore. I can't survive another lie." We stared at each other across the kitchen while the refrigerator hummed and the clock on the wall ticked away seconds of a life that no longer made sense. Finally, Richard set down the broom and leaned against the counter. "How long have you known?" he asked. The casual tone of his question hit me harder than anger would have. He wasn't denying it. He wasn't begging for forgiveness or expressing remorse. He was simply adjusting his strategy now that his secret was out. "Since the spa," I whispered, "when I saw her name on the receipt, when I found the photos in your suitcase." He nodded slowly, as if processing this information for tactical purposes. "I was wondering when you'd figure it out. You've been acting strange." Strange. I was acting strange because I'd discovered my husband was having an affair with our daughter, and his primary concern was how it might inconvenience him. "How long?" I asked. "How long has this been going on?" "It started during the pandemic," he said, and his voice actually softened with what sounded like fondness. "We were talking so much, connecting in ways we never had before. She was lonely, I was lonely. You were being yourself, being myself. What crime had I committed by being myself? What terrible offense had I given by existing in my own home?" "She's our daughter," I said, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. "She's a grown woman," Richard replied. "She's 34 years old, Eleanor. She can make her own choices about who she wants to be with. You groomed her." The accusation came out stronger than I felt. "You've been grooming her since she was a child." For the first time, Richard's expression darkened. "Don't be disgusting. This is between two consenting adults who happen to care about each other more than you can understand." "Care about each other?" I laughed, and the sound was harsh and bitter. "You mean you found a way to control her that I never could, and she found a way to get what she wanted without having to earn it." "Claire loves me," Richard said, and there was genuine emotion in his voice for the first time since our conversation began. "She understands me in ways you never did. She appreciates what I have to offer." "What you have to offer? You mean my inheritance money? My Social Security checks? The house I helped pay for?" Richard's jaw tightened. "You've never appreciated anything I've done for this family. You've taken everything for granted. Claire sees my worth." The delusion was breathtaking. In his mind, he was the victim in this scenario. The poor, unappreciated husband who'd been driven to seek understanding elsewhere. The fact that elsewhere was his own daughter seemed to be a minor detail. "Where is this going, Richard?" I asked. "What's the end game here? Are you planning to divorce me and marry her? Live happily ever after while I disappear? His silence was more terrifying than any words could have been. Oh my God, I breathed. You are. You're actually planning to get rid of me. Eleanor, you're being dramatic. The notebook, I interrupted. I saw the notebook, the references to my inheritance, to what happens when I pass. You've been planning this for years. Richard's mask slipped entirely then. The man I saw standing in my kitchen was someone I'd never met before. Cold, calculating, and completely without remorse. You're 72 years old, he said quietly. You're not in great health. These things happen naturally. No one would be surprised. The casual way he discussed my death made my blood freeze. This wasn't just about an affair or even financial abuse. They were planning something far worse. You're talking about murder, I whispered. I'm talking about reality. About the fact that Claire and I have a future together, and you're in the way of that future. I backed away from him, suddenly aware of how isolated we were in this house, how far we lived from neighbors who might hear if I screamed, how easily an elderly woman could have a fall or a heart attack or any number of accidents that would free up her assets for redistribution. You're insane, I said. Both of you. You're completely insane. We're in love, Richard replied, as if that explained everything. As if love was an excuse for destroying another human being. Something you wouldn't understand. That's when I heard the front door open. Claire's voice called out from the hallway. Daddy, I got your message. Is she gone yet? She appeared in the kitchen doorway looking radiant and expectant, her face glowing with the kind of happiness I hadn't seen from her in years. She was dressed beautifully. Designer clothes, professional makeup, expensive jewelry that I knew I'd never seen before, but that looked familiar from the photos I'd found. When she saw me standing there, her expression shifted to annoyance rather than shame or guilt. Mom, she said flatly, I thought you were at book club. Book club was canceled, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. Apparently I'm interrupting something. Claire looked at Richard, and some wordless communication passed between them. Then she stepped into the kitchen and took his hand, right in front of me, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that was unmistakably intimate. She knows, Richard said simply. Claire's reaction was not what I expected. Instead of embarrassment or apology, she looked relieved, almost triumphant. Good, she said. I'm tired of sneaking around. I'm tired of pretending to care about her feelings when she's never cared about mine. Your feelings? I stared at my daughter, searching for any trace of the little girl I'd raised, the child I'd sacrificed everything for. What feelings did I ignore? What did I ever do to you that would justify this? You never saw me, Claire said, her voice rising with years of accumulated resentment. You never understood what I needed. You were always so focused on being the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect doormat. You never fought for anything, never demanded anything better for yourself or for me. I gave you everything I had. You gave me guilt, Claire shouted. You gave me this pathetic example of what women should be, grateful for scraps, thankful for crumbs, always putting everyone else first until there's nothing left of yourself. I swore I would never be like you. The cruelty in her voice was like a physical blow. This was how my daughter saw me. Not as a woman who'd sacrificed for her family, but as a cautionary tale of female weakness. So you decided to sleep with your father instead? I asked. That's your idea of strength? I decided to take what I wanted for once in my life, Claire replied. Daddy appreciates me. He sees my worth. He doesn't make me feel guilty for having ambitions and desires. He groomed you, I said again, desperately trying to reach whatever part of my daughter might still be salvageable. He manipulated you into thinking this is normal, this is healthy. Stop calling it grooming. Claire's face was flushed with anger now. I chose this. I pursued this. I wanted this relationship because it's the only one that's ever made me feel valued. I looked back and forth between them, my husband and my daughter, holding hands in my kitchen, united in their conviction that I was the problem, that I was the obstacle to their happiness, that my elimination would be not just beneficial, but necessary for their future together. What happens now? I asked quietly. Now, Richard said, we discuss how to handle this situation in a way that works for everyone. but I could see in their eyes that their definition of working for everyone didn't include me being alive much longer. Standing in my own kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of a life I'd thought was real, I finally understood that I was completely alone with two people who saw my continued existence as inconvenient, and they were already planning to solve that inconvenience. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house settling, every rustle of wind against the windows, every sound Richard made in his sleep beside me felt like a potential threat. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with the terrible knowledge that the two people who were supposed to love me most in the world were planning my death. They had been so casual about it, so matter of fact, as if discussing my murder was no different from planning a grocery list or deciding where to go for dinner. The ease with which they talked about my natural demise told me this wasn't a new conversation between them. They had been rehearsing this scenario, perhaps for months. Around 3 a.m, I heard Richard's phone buzz quietly on his nightstand. He stirred, reached for it, and I watched through barely open eyes as his face was illuminated by the screen. He smiled, actually smiled, at whatever message he was reading. Then he typed back something brief before setting the phone down and settling back into sleep. I waited until his breathing became deep and regular again, then carefully slipped out of bed. My bare feet made no sound on the hardwood floor as I crept to the bathroom and quietly closed the door. In the dark, I sat on the edge of the bathtub and tried to think clearly about my situation. I was a 72-year-old woman with no close friends, no family except the two people who wanted me dead, and no resources of my own since Richard controlled all our finances. If I went to the police with this story, what proof did I have? Photos of Richard and Claire together could be explained away as innocent father-daughter bonding. Their conversations about my death could be dismissed as estate planning, or the dark humor of people dealing with an aging family member. Who would believe that a respected man like Richard would murder his wife to be with his daughter? Who would accept that a successful, educated woman like Claire would participate in such a scheme? On paper, they looked like model citizens. I looked like a possibly senile elderly woman making outrageous accusations. But I couldn't just wait for them to act. I couldn't pretend this conversation hadn't happened and hope they would change their minds. The coldness in their eyes, the way they looked at me like I was already gone, that wasn't something people came back from. For the first time in 51 years of marriage, I was going to have to save myself. The next morning, I got up early and made Richard's coffee as usual. I scrambled his eggs exactly the way he liked them, with a touch of cream and fresh chives from the herb garden I maintained outside our kitchen window. I served him breakfast with the same smile I'd been perfecting for decades, the smile that said everything was normal and I was grateful for whatever attention he chose to give me. "I think I'll go visit my sister today," I said casually as he read the newspaper. Richard looked up with surprise. "Sarah, I thought you two weren't speaking." Sarah and I had indeed had a falling out 3 years ago over something I could barely remember now. Some comment she'd made about Richard that I'd taken offense to at the time. How ironic that I'd defended him against her instincts, her warnings that something wasn't right about the way he treated me. "I think it's time we made up," I said. "Life's too short to hold grudges." Richard nodded absently and returned to his paper. "Drive carefully. Take your phone." The concern in his voice sounded genuine, which made it even more disturbing. He could worry about my safety on a 2-hour drive while simultaneously planning my permanent elimination. The cognitive dissonance was breathtaking. I packed a small overnight bag, telling Richard I might stay the night if Sarah and I had a lot to catch up on. He seemed pleased by this plan, probably because it would give him and Claire more time together without having to worry about my presence. But I didn't drive to Sarah's house. Instead, I drove to the First National Bank in the next town over, where I'd maintained a small checking account that Richard didn't know about. It was an account I'd opened years ago with tips from the diner, money I'd saved in $20 and $50 increments and never mentioned to anyone. The balance was modest, just over $3,000, but it was mine alone. I withdrew every penny in cash. Next, I drove to a law office I'd found in the phone book, the kind of small practice that advertised family law and estate planning. The receptionist was a kind woman in her 50s who looked at me with the sort of professional compassion that suggested she'd seen plenty of women in desperate situations. "I need to speak with a lawyer about protecting myself," I told her quietly. "I think my husband might be planning to hurt me." Margaret Chen, that was the lawyer's name, listened to my story with the careful attention of someone who'd heard similar accounts before. She didn't seem shocked by the details about Richard and Claire's relationship, nor did she dismiss my fears about their intentions. "Emotional and financial abuse often escalate," she said, taking notes as I spoke. "And when the victim begins to resist or threatens to expose the situation, the danger increases significantly." She helped me understand my legal options. I could file for divorce and request a restraining order, but that would require going to court and making public accusations I might not be able to prove. I could report their financial manipulation to Adult Protective Services, but investigations took time I might not have. "What I can do immediately," Margaret said, "is help you secure your assets and create a safety plan. We can change the beneficiaries on any accounts you have sole access to, document their threats, and set up a paper trail that would be difficult for them to cover up if something happens to you." For the first time in days, I felt a spark of hope. Someone believed me. Someone was taking my situation seriously and offering concrete help instead of platitudes or dismissal. We spent the next 2 hours going through my financial situation in detail. Margaret was appalled by the extent to which Richard had isolated me from our shared resources, but she was impressed that I'd maintained that secret account. "This shows foresight," she said. "Part of you has been preparing for this moment, even if you didn't realize it consciously." She helped me write a detailed account of everything I'd discovered. The photos, the receipts, the notebook entries, the conversations about my death. We made multiple copies and stored them in different locations, including one with Margaret's office and one in a safety deposit box I opened that afternoon. "If anything happens to you," Margaret explained, "these documents will ensure that the investigation looks beyond natural causes or accidents." The safety deposit box felt like taking out an insurance policy on my own life. It was terrifying and empowering at the same time. That evening, I called Sarah from a gas station payphone on my way home. She answered on the second ring, her voice cautious but not unwelcoming. "Eleanor, is everything all right?" "No," I said, and then I started crying. "Sarah, I need help. I need help, and I don't know who else to call." "Where are you? Are you hurt?" "I'm not hurt yet, but I think Richard and Claire are planning to hurt me." There was a long pause. Then Sarah said quietly, "I'm coming to get you." "Where are you?" "I can't leave yet. I need to gather more evidence first." "But Sarah, if something happens to me, nothing is going to happen to you," she said firmly. "I'm going to drive down tomorrow, and we're going to figure this out together." I should have listened to my instincts about Richard years ago. When I got home that night, Richard was in an excellent mood. He'd made dinner for himself, something he'd never done in all our years of marriage, and was whistling while he cleaned up the kitchen. "How was your visit with Sarah?" he asked, seeming genuinely interested in my answer. "Good," I said. "Really good. We talked about a lot of things we should have discussed years ago." "I'm glad you two are speaking again," Richard said. "Family is important." The irony of him saying that made my stomach turn. But I managed to smile and nod, playing the role of the grateful wife one more time. "I think I'll be seeing more of her," I added. "Maybe take some trips together. We talked about visiting that spa in Vermont she's always wanted to try." Richard's expression flickered for just a moment. So briefly I might have imagined it. But I thought I saw something like annoyance cross his face before the pleasant mask returned. "That sounds nice," he said. "You deserve some time away." That night, as I lay in bed listening to Richard sleep, I felt different. For the first time in my adult life, I had taken action to protect myself without asking anyone's permission or waiting for someone else to save me. I had money they didn't know about, legal representation they couldn't control, and people who knew the truth about what was happening. I was still terrified. I was still in danger. But I was no longer completely helpless. And that small flame of resistance, that tiny spark of self-preservation I'd finally allowed myself to nurture, was growing stronger by the hour. Tomorrow, I would take the next step. Tomorrow, I would start fighting back in earnest. But tonight, for the first time in months, I slept peacefully, knowing that I had finally stopped being a victim and started being a survivor. Sarah arrived the next afternoon like a force of nature. I watched through the kitchen window as her silver Honda pulled into our driveway, and for the first time in months, I felt like I had an ally. She looked exactly the same as I remembered, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, and carrying herself with the confidence of a woman who had never let anyone diminish her worth. Richard was at work, or at least that's where he'd said he was going. These days, I assumed every absence was actually time spent with Claire. Every business meeting was actually another planning session for my elimination. "My God, Eleanor," Sarah said the moment she saw me. "You look like a ghost." I did. I'd lost 20 pounds over the past month, and my clothes hung loose on a frame that had always been sturdy. My hair, which I'd always kept carefully styled, was limp and lifeless. But my eyes had changed the most. They no longer held the defeated acceptance that had characterized my expression for years. Now they burned with something Sarah recognized immediately. "You look angry," she said. And it wasn't a criticism, it was admiration. "I am angry," I replied. "I'm finally angry." We spent the afternoon going through everything I'd discovered. Sarah examined the copies of photos I'd made, read the notebook entries I'd transcribed, and studied the financial documents Margaret had helped me organize. With each piece of evidence, her expression grew darker. "This is beyond sick," she said finally. "Eleanor, they're not just planning to steal from you, they're planning to kill you." Hearing someone else say it made it real in a way it hadn't been before. Sarah believed me completely, without question or doubt, and her certainty validated my own fears. "I know," I said. "The question is, what do I do about it? We call the police. We call social services. And tell them what? That my husband and daughter are having an affair and talking about my death? Sarah, look at this from the outside. Richard is a respected member of the community. Claire has a successful career. I'm a 72-year-old woman with no witnesses and nothing but circumstantial evidence." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, understanding the impossible position I was in. Finally, she asked, "What do you want to happen here, Eleanor? What would justice look like to you?" The question surprised me because no one had ever asked what I wanted before. Not in my marriage, not in my relationship with Claire, not in any aspect of my life. I'd spent so many decades responding to other people's needs that I'd forgotten I was allowed to have preferences of my own. "I want them to face consequences," I said slowly. "I want them to lose the things they value most. I want them to feel as helpless and betrayed as they've made me feel." "Then we need to be smarter than they are," Sarah said. "We need to set a trap." That evening, when Richard came home, I was in the kitchen preparing dinner as usual. But Sarah was sitting at our dining room table, clearly visible from where Richard stood in the doorway. "Sarah?" he said, his voice carefully neutral. "This is unexpected." "Hello, Richard," she replied coolly. "Eleanor and I have been having such an interesting conversation." I watched Richard's face carefully as he processed this information. His eyes flicked between Sarah and me, calculating what we might have discussed, assessing the threat level. "I'm glad you two are talking again," he said finally. "Family relationships are so important." "Yes," Sarah agreed. "They really are. Eleanor's been telling me all about your recent family dynamics." The word dynamics hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained pleasant when he responded. "I hope she's not boring you with our domestic routine," he said. "Oh, quite the opposite," Sarah replied. "Your domestic arrangements are fascinating, quite unconventional." Richard excused himself to change clothes, but I could see the wheels turning in his head. He was wondering how much Sarah knew, how much of a problem she might become, whether he needed to adjust his timeline. While he was upstairs, I quickly called Claire using the house phone. "Claire, it's Mom. Could you come over tonight? There's something we need to discuss as a family." "What kind of something?" Claire's voice was suspicious. "Sarah's here visiting, and she's asking some uncomfortable questions about our finances. I think it would be better if we all talked together." It was brilliant bait, and Claire took it immediately. "I'll be right there." 20 minutes later, Claire walked into our living room, where Sarah, Richard, and I were sitting in a triangle of tension. Claire looked beautiful as always, perfectly dressed, perfectly made up, radiating the confidence of someone who believed she was in complete control of the situation. "Sarah," she said with false warmth. "What a surprise." "Hello, Claire," Sarah replied. "You look well, glowing even." The compliment was delivered with just enough edge to make Claire's smile falter slightly. "Mom said you had questions about finances?" Claire directed this to Sarah, clearly hoping to control the conversation. "Oh, I have questions about much more than finances," Sarah said. "I have questions about hotel receipts and jewelry purchases and some very interesting photographs." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard and Claire exchanged a look that confirmed everything I'd suspected about their coordination. "I'm not sure what you're implying," Richard said carefully. "I'm not implying anything," Sarah replied. "I'm stating facts. Eleanor has shown me quite a collection of evidence documenting your relationship with your daughter." "You're mistaken," Claire began. "Am I?" Sarah pulled out a folder from her purse. "Because I have copies of everything right here. The photos, the receipts, the notebook documenting your plans for Eleanor's natural death." Richard stood up abruptly. "This is ridiculous. Eleanor, you're obviously having some kind of breakdown." "Sit down, Richard," I said quietly. The tone of my voice surprised everyone, including myself. It wasn't the voice of the accommodating wife they were used to. It was the voice of a woman who had finally stopped caring about keeping the peace. I said, "Sit down." Richard sat. "Now," I continued, "we're going to have an honest conversation for once. No more lies, no more manipulation, no more pretending. Sarah knows everything. My lawyer knows everything. The police know everything." "The police?" Claire's voice cracked slightly. "Oh, yes," Sarah said smoothly. "We visited the station this afternoon, filed a report about financial elder abuse and threats against Eleanor's life. Amazing how seriously they take those kinds of accusations these days." This was a lie. We hadn't gone to the police yet, but Richard and Claire didn't know that. "You're both insane," Claire said, but her bravado was cracking. "No one will believe this story." "Maybe not," I said, "but they'll investigate. And investigations have a way of uncovering all sorts of interesting information. Bank records, hotel security footage, phone records. Amazing what the authorities can piece together when they start looking." Richard was calculating again. I could see it in his eyes. He was trying to determine whether this was a bluff or whether his carefully constructed plans were actually in jeopardy. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "I want you both out of my house," I said. "Tonight. I want you to take nothing except your personal clothes. I want you to transfer all my money back to accounts in my name only. And I want you to disappear from my life completely." "You can't," Claire started. "I can," I interrupted. "This is my house too. Half of everything we own is mine by law. The other half can go to lawyers if you want to fight about it." "And if we refuse?" Richard asked. "Then we go to the police with everything we have," Sarah said. "Elder abuse, financial manipulation, conspiracy to commit murder. Even if they can't prove everything, the scandal alone will destroy both your reputations." The threat hung in the air while Richard and Claire processed their options. They could fight, but they'd be fighting from a position of weakness now. They could run, but where would they go? Their whole plan had depended on having my assets to fund their new life together. "You're making a mistake," Claire said, her voice vicious now that her mask was slipping. "You're a pathetic old woman who never gave me anything but guilt and low expectations. I found someone who actually values me, who sees my worth. You found someone who groomed you into thinking incest was love," I replied calmly. "And now you're about to lose everything because you were stupid enough to believe him." The word incest hit like a slap. Claire's face went white, then red with fury. "How dare you? Pack your things," I said, standing up. "Both of you. You have 1 hour." They tried arguing, pleading, threatening, but Sarah and I simply sat in the living room and waited while they gathered their belongings. Every few minutes, one of them would come downstairs to try a different approach. Richard attempting to gaslight me about my memories. Claire trying to guilt me about breaking up the family. But I was done being manipulated. I was done caring more about their feelings than my own survival. When they finally left, dragging suitcases and cardboard boxes to Claire's car, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: complete silence. Not the lonely silence of being ignored, but the peaceful silence of being alone by choice. "How do you feel?" Sarah asked as we watched their taillights disappear down the street. "Free," I said, and meant it. For the first time in my adult life, I feel free. That night, I changed all the locks on my house and slept better than I had in years, knowing that the people who wanted to destroy me could no longer reach me. The war wasn't over yet, but I had won the first major battle. The first morning I woke up alone in my house felt like being born again. Sunlight streamed through the bedroom windows. Windows I opened wide for the first time in years, letting fresh air replace the stagnant atmosphere of secrets and lies that had suffocated me for so long. I made coffee for one person. I scrambled eggs for one person. I sat at the kitchen table reading the newspaper without anyone commenting on my reading speed or criticizing the sections I chose to focus on. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of possibility. Sarah had stayed for 3 days after the confrontation, helping me change passwords, close joint accounts, and begin the legal process of protecting myself. But now she was back home, and I was learning what it meant to exist entirely for myself. The first week was strange. I found myself making Richard's coffee out of habit, then remembering he was gone and pouring it down the sink. I would start to prepare dinner for 2, then catch myself and laugh at the absurdity. 51 years of conditioning doesn't disappear overnight, but each moment of realization felt like breaking another chain. Margaret, my lawyer, helped me understand the full extent of what Richard had stolen from me over the years. Beyond the obvious financial manipulation, he had systematically isolated me from opportunities, friendships, and experiences that might have given me independence. He had convinced me that my dreams were silly, my ideas were worthless, and my value existed only in service to others. "Economic abuse is about more than money," Margaret explained during one of our meetings. "It's about creating dependence so complete that the victim can't imagine surviving without the abuser." But I was surviving. More than that, I was beginning to thrive. 2 weeks after Richard and Claire left, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I went shopping for myself, not for groceries or household necessities, but for things that brought me joy. I bought books, novels I'd always wanted to read but never had time for. I bought art supplies, remembering how much I'd loved painting before marriage, and motherhood consumed all my creative energy. I bought a beautiful journal with a leather cover, something special enough to deserve my thoughts. The saleswoman at the art store was a young woman with paint-stained fingers and kind eyes. When she asked what medium I was interested in exploring, I realized I couldn't remember the last time someone had asked me about my preferences, my interests, my desires. "I used to paint," I said hesitantly. "Watercolors mostly. But it's been, well, probably 30 years. "It's never too late to start again," she said, and something in her voice reminded me of who I used to be before I became Richard's wife and Claire's mother. Muscle memory is amazing. Your hands will remember what your heart loved. I bought watercolors, brushes, paper, and an easel that folded up for easy storage. Carrying those supplies to my car felt like carrying pieces of my former self home. That evening, I set up the easel in the living room, in the spot where Richard's chair used to sit, the chair from which he'd controlled the television remote and dictated our evening entertainment. I painted the view from my window, the maple tree in our backyard, now brilliant with fall colors I'd been too exhausted to notice during previous autumns. The first brushstrokes were tentative, uncertain, but as the colors flowed across the paper, something inside me began to unlock. I wasn't painting a masterpiece. I was painting my way back to myself. A month after reclaiming my house, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. I booked a trip, not a practical trip to visit family or handle business, but a purely selfish journey to see something beautiful. I chose Savannah, Georgia, a city I'd dreamed of visiting since reading about its historic district in a magazine years ago. "Are you sure you want to travel alone?" Margaret asked when I told her about my plans. "After everything you've been through?" "Especially after everything I've been through," I replied. "I need to prove to myself that I can navigate the world without someone else's permission or protection." The train ride to Savannah was my first solo journey in over 5 decades. I sat by the window watching the landscape change, feeling like an explorer discovering a new continent. Other passengers chatted with friends or worked on laptops, but I simply observed, absorbed, existed in the moment without having to consider anyone else's needs or preferences. In Savannah, I stayed at a small bed and breakfast run by a woman named Grace, who was close to my age, and had the warmth of someone who understood that healing often required solitude. My room overlooked a garden where Spanish moss draped ancient oak trees like nature's own lace curtains. I spent 3 days walking through the historic squares, visiting art galleries, and sitting in parks where I could sketch and paint without anyone asking why I wasn't doing something more productive with my time. I ate meals when I was hungry, not when the clock dictated. I stayed up late reading and slept until I naturally woke up. I talked to strangers who had no preconceptions about who I was supposed to be. On my last evening in Savannah, I sat on a bench in Forsyth Park as the sun set through the tree canopy. An elderly man feeding pigeons struck up a conversation, and when he asked about my life, I found myself telling the truth. I just left a 51-year marriage, I said. I'm learning how to be myself again. He nodded as if this was perfectly normal. My wife passed 3 years ago, he said. Took me 2 years to remember who I was before I became half of we. It's scary as hell, but also kind of wonderful, isn't it? It was wonderful. Terrifying and lonely sometimes, but wonderful. When I returned home, the house felt different. It wasn't just the absence of Richard and Claire's possessions. It was the presence of my own energy, my own choices, my own rhythm of living. I had rearranged furniture to suit my preferences, hung my paintings on walls that had been decorated according to other people's tastes, filled spaces with things that made me happy instead of things that impressed visitors. The legal battles were ongoing. Richard had hired an expensive lawyer and was fighting the divorce settlement, claiming I was mentally incompetent and had been influenced by Sarah to make irrational decisions. Claire had joined his side, painting me as a vindictive mother who couldn't accept her daughter's happiness. But I had evidence, I had witnesses, and most importantly, I had found my voice. In depositions and court hearings, I spoke clearly and calmly about what had been done to me. I didn't minimize or excuse or apologize for their behavior. I simply told the truth and let the consequences fall where they belonged. The most unexpected gift came from an unlikely source. 3 months after the confrontation, I received a phone call from a young woman who introduced herself as Jennifer, one of Claire's former co-workers. I heard about what happened, she said carefully, and I wanted you to know that some of us aren't surprised. Claire used to talk about her relationship with your husband in ways that made us uncomfortable. She would brag about how she could get anything she wanted from him, how he understood her better than any boyfriend ever had. Jennifer's testimony became crucial evidence in my case. It corroborated my claims about the inappropriate nature of Richard and Claire's relationship and established a timeline that supported my accusations. But more than helping my legal case, Jennifer's call reminded me that I wasn't crazy, wasn't imagining things, wasn't the problem. Other people had witnessed the dysfunction and manipulation that I'd been trained to accept as normal. As winter turned to spring, I began to notice changes in myself that went beyond the obvious ones. I stood straighter, spoke more confidently, made eye contact with people instead of looking away. I had opinions about current events, preferences about entertainment, ideas about how I wanted to spend my time. I joined a watercolor class at the community center and discovered a talent I'd forgotten I possessed. I volunteered at the local animal shelter, finding purpose in caring for creatures who needed love without manipulation or ulterior motives. I started attending a book club where literary discussions happened without anyone dismissing my contributions as naive or irrelevant. Most surprisingly, I began to make friends. Real friends. People who valued my company for its own sake rather than for what I could provide for them. Women who had also survived difficult marriages. Younger people who appreciated my perspective. Couples who included me in their social activities without treating me like a charity case. The Eleanor who had cowered in that spa bathroom, clutching a receipt that shattered her world, felt like a different person entirely. That woman had been so broken down by decades of psychological abuse that she couldn't imagine surviving on her own. This woman, the woman I was becoming, Couldn't imagine going back to a life where her worth was determined by other people's needs. 6 months after reclaiming my life, I received a letter from Claire. It was forwarded through Margaret's office, as I had instructed that all communication from my former family go through legal channels. The letter was full of accusations and self-pity, blaming me for destroying her happiness and painting herself as the victim of my vindictiveness. She claimed that her relationship with Richard was pure love, that I was too small-minded to understand. She accused me of being jealous of their connection and punishing them for finding joy together. Reading her words, I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no guilt. Claire's letter was like a transmission from a foreign planet, describing a reality that had nothing to do with mine. The woman who had once been desperate for her daughter's approval couldn't even recognize the person who had written those cruel, delusional words. I threw the letter away without responding, not because I was too hurt to reply, but because there was simply nothing left to say to people who lived in a world where destroying others was justified by their own desires. That evening, I sat in my garden as twilight settled over the neighborhood. The maple tree Richard and I had planted when Claire was a baby was in full bloom, its branches reaching toward the sky with a confidence I was only now learning to emulate. For the first time in my adult life, I was exactly where I wanted to be, with exactly the people I chose to have around me, which, at that moment, was just myself, and that felt like the greatest victory of all. 1 year later, I stood in the same kitchen where my world had collapsed, but everything was different now. The morning light streaming through windows I kept open revealed a space that finally felt like home rather than a prison. Fresh flowers from my garden sat in a vase I'd chosen myself, bright yellow sunflowers that turned their faces toward the light, just as I had learned to do. The legal proceedings had concluded 6 months earlier. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s who'd clearly seen her share of family destruction, had not been sympathetic to Richard and Claire's claims. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showing systematic theft, testimony from witnesses who'd observed their inappropriate relationship, psychological evaluations that confirmed the manipulative dynamics Margaret had helped me document. Richard lost everything. His reputation, his assets, his comfortable retirement. He was ordered to repay the money he'd stolen from me, plus damages for emotional distress. Claire, as an accomplice in the financial abuse, faced her own legal consequences. Her career in marketing crumbled when the scandal became public knowledge, and the lifestyle she'd been planning with my stolen money evaporated like morning mist. But the most satisfying victory wasn't legal or financial. It was personal. It was the woman I saw in the mirror each morning, a woman with bright eyes, confident posture, and a smile that came from genuine contentment, rather than desperate people-pleasing. The doorbell rang, interrupting my morning reflection. Through the window, I saw a delivery truck, and my heart lifted. Today was the day my latest painting would be delivered to its new owner. A watercolor of the Savannah Squares that had sold at a local gallery for more money than I'd ever imagined my art could command. As I signed for the package containing the commission details for my next piece, I marveled at how completely my life had transformed. At 73, I had become a working artist, selling paintings that captured the beauty I'd finally learned to see in the world around me. The phone rang as I was preparing lunch for myself, a luxurious salad with ingredients I'd chosen because they pleased me, not because they met someone else's dietary requirements or budget constraints. "Eleanor? It's Grace, from the bed and breakfast in Savannah." I smiled, remembering the kind woman who'd made my first solo journey so welcoming. We'd stayed in touch, exchanging letters about books, gardens, and the ongoing adventure of rediscovering ourselves in our later years. "Grace, how wonderful to hear from you. I'm calling with an invitation," she said, excitement clear in her voice. "I'm organizing a retreat here in the fall, a week-long program for women who are starting new chapters in their lives. Would you consider being one of our speakers? Your story of transformation has inspired so many of the guests who've stayed here." My story. A year ago, I would have been horrified at the thought of anyone knowing the shameful details of my marriage and betrayal. Now, I understood that my experience could be a beacon for other women trapped in similar situations. "I'd be honored," I said, and meant it. After hanging up, I walked through my house, seeing it with fresh eyes. The living room where I'd once sat invisible while Richard and Claire bonded over conversations that excluded me now served as my art studio. Paintings in various stages of completion covered easels and walls, each one a testament to dreams I'd thought were dead forever. The dining room where I'd served countless meals to people who took my labor for granted now hosted dinner parties for friends who appreciated both my cooking and my company. The bedroom where I'd lain awake in terror, wondering if I'd survive the night, now welcomed me each evening with books I'd chosen, pillows arranged for my comfort alone, and the profound peace of knowing I was safe. That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery where my parents were buried. I'd avoided visiting their graves for years because Richard always complained about the time it took, the maintenance fees, the morbid dwelling on the past. And now I came regularly, not out of grief, but out of gratitude. "I finally understand what you tried to teach me, Mama," I said, kneeling to place fresh flowers on her headstone. "You always said that love shouldn't make you smaller. I just forgot to listen." My mother had been a strong woman who'd raised 3 daughters during the Depression, teaching us that our worth came from our character, not from our ability to serve others. Somehow, in my eagerness to be the perfect wife and mother, I'd abandoned those lessons. But they had been waiting for me all along, dormant seeds that finally found the right conditions to grow. As evening approached, I stopped at the grocery store where I'd worked for 18 years before Parker's Market. The manager, Mrs. Rodriguez, always greeted me warmly when I shopped there now. "Eleanor, how's the art business?" she asked, genuinely interested in my answer. "Thriving," I said, still amazed to be able to say that truthfully. "I have 3 commissions lined up and a gallery show next month. That's wonderful. You know, some of the younger girls here have been asking about you. Word gets around about women who make dramatic life changes. You're becoming something of a local legend." A legend. Me, the woman who'd once been so invisible that customers barely acknowledged my existence, who'd apologized for taking up space in my own home. The irony was beautiful. That evening, I sat on my back porch with a glass of wine I'd chosen because I liked the label, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades I now knew how to capture with my brushes. My neighbor's dog, a golden retriever who reminded me painfully of Max at first, had become a regular visitor. His owner, a widow named Dorothy who'd moved in 6 months ago, often joined me for these evening conversations. "You know what I admire most about you?" Dorothy said, settling into the chair I kept for her visits. "You didn't just survive what happened to you. You transformed it into something beautiful." "I had to," I said simply. "The alternative was letting them kill who I really was." We sat in comfortable silence, 2 women who'd learned that solitude wasn't loneliness when you genuinely enjoyed your own company. The sunset reminded me of the evening in Savannah when I'd first begun to understand that my life could be more than service to ungrateful people. That moment felt like a lifetime ago, though it had been less than 2 years. Later that night, I opened my journal to record the day's experiences, a practice that had become as essential as breathing. Writing helped me process the magnitude of my transformation and document insights I wanted to remember during difficult moments. "Today I realized," I wrote, "that the woman who was betrayed in that spa hotel room died exactly when she needed to. She died so that I could be born. She died so that I could stop begging to be loved and start demanding to be respected. She died so that I could discover that the most important relationship I'll ever have is the one with myself." I closed the journal and prepared for bed, going through rituals that were entirely my own choice. I read poetry that stirred my soul, applied lotion that smelled like lavender because it pleased me, and arranged my pillows exactly as I liked them. Simple pleasures that had been denied to me for decades by people who convinced me that my preferences didn't matter. Before turning off the light, I looked at the framed photo on my nightstand. Not a family picture, but a painting I'd done of a lone tree growing on a clifftop, its branches bent by wind but reaching skyward with undeniable strength. It reminded me daily that survival often requires growing in directions others don't expect or approve of. As I settled into sleep, I thought about the women who might hear my story someday. Women who were living my old life, diminished, dismissed, convinced they were lucky to receive scraps of attention from people who should treasure them. Women who believed they were too old, too tired, too damaged to start over. I wanted them to know what I'd learned, that it's never too late to save yourself, that the love you think you can't live without might be the very thing that's slowly killing who you're meant to be. That respect isn't negotiable, and anyone who asks you to settle for less isn't worthy of your time or energy. Most importantly, I wanted them to understand that the woman who's been buried under years of other people's expectations is still there, waiting to be rediscovered. She's been patient, but she's also been preparing. And when you finally decide to excavate her, you'll be amazed at her strength, her wisdom, and her absolute determination to never be invisible again. The last thought I had before sleep claimed me was this. I had spent 72 years learning how to be someone else's idea of a good woman, but it had taken only 1 year to remember how to be myself. And that woman, the real Eleanor, the one I was always meant to be, was magnificent. Now, I want to ask you something. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Have you ever wondered if the people closest to you truly see your worth, or if they've just gotten comfortable taking it for granted? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story matters, and someone out there needs to hear it. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel. These messages need to reach the women who are still waiting for permission to save themselves. Sometimes, all it takes is knowing that someone else found the courage to start over,